morning, everybody, even though you on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro will be hearing the Montpelier Happy Hour at 2 p.m. We are live on Facebook at the lovely hour of 7:14 a.m. with Representative Laura Sibilia, Representative Emilie Kornheiser, and myself, your host, Olga Peters. Welcome to the Montpelier Happy Hour. And hello, Laura. Hello, Emilie. Whew, it's been quite a week in the legislature. The Senate has put forward a budget, passed a 7.2 billion budget. And then, of course, the Global Solutions Act, which is what we're going to talk now about. For those who are following along at home, that is H688. The governor vetoed it. And it looks like the House has overridden the veto. It looks like the Senate will override the veto. Help me and help the listeners at home understand, what were some of the governor's concerns? And why does the legislature feel the bill as it stands now is the better option compared to some of the solutions the governor wanted you to change? That makes sense at 7:14 in the morning.
And can I, while Laura gathers her thoughts, remind listeners that some 6 months ago or so, we had a show about the Global Warming Solutions Act when we were first passing it through the House. And I believe Representative Tim Briglin came on to talk to us about a bill that before the House passed it and then sent it to the Senate, and then it came back and then it got vetoed. And now we're back here again because this is actually very fast for government work.
It is. And for those who need another reminder, the Global Solution Act focuses on climate change and mitigating climate change.
It does, yes. And I'm so happy to hear Tim was on. Tim, the amount of work that he put in, folks like yourself, Emilie, part of the Climate Caucus last fall, wow. I feel really good about this bill. So I was happy that we overrode yesterday. Some of the governor's concerns, I will start by saying that the administration was involved with this bill early on in the session. Prior to COVID, we had ongoing dialogue with them. The bill actually was introduced the year before, a separate bill. But also called the Global Warming Solutions Act. And it really, based on feedback from the governor and others, it really
including you, Laura.
What's that?
Including
me.
you.
Yes,
yeah.
There was no way I would support it. And so Representative Briglin actually, in particular, spent the better part of a year really trying to understand the challenges that folks had that wanted to move on climate change, including the governor, and how to put forward a more responsible bill. We took a lot of testimony, worked with the governor. He was pretty consistent on his concerns about the size of the council, so the council's 24 members, about the cause of action that is in the bill, and then also about the fact that the legislature did not have to approve the plan. And what I'm here to tell you is none of those things are new concepts. They're all concepts that exist now in state government. And, I think that, we can talk about those aspects piece by piece if you like. The thing that I spoke about yesterday was really about there's been a lot of talk about this unelected, unapproved, accountable to no one board that is being brought together to develop a climate plan, a plan for climate change and adaptation in Vermont. And a lot of insistence that legislators should create that plan. Legislators create very few of those types of plans. That's really the fact of the matter.
They're almost always created by either a department or a
Yes.
non-elected but appointed board, commission, et cetera. I mean, we have task forces, boards, and commissions. That's how most of our planning is done. We don't have the
Right.
capacity within the legislature to do that kind of planning work. It's something Olga and I talk about all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you might find a legislator or two on a committee that is putting together a plan because they happen to have some expert knowledge or experience in the subject matter. But pretty typical for when you're putting together a plan to have it be representative. So this plan has 8 appointees from the governor, including many members of his cabinet, chaired by the governor. The Speaker of the House has 8 appointees, and the Committee on Committees in the Senate, which is that group of 3, they also have 8 appointees. And there are,
and that's how almost every commission in state government is
Right.
like sort of more important commission in state government is formed. It's those sort of 3 groups of people or 3 people appoint positions to it.
Right. And making sure that that the various branches have their folks there that they think are credible and helpful to the process. So, there will be folks from business. There will be climate experts. There will be environmental advocates. There will be folks in the manufacturing sector. There will be folks from the fuel sector. Because fossil fuels, I mean, that industry, those are really important jobs. That's, an economic contributor to our economy. There's a huge effect there. Part of this bill is about how are we going to grapple with the effects from climate change and having to reduce fossil fuel usage. That was one of the governor's concerns, was about this unelected, unaccountable board. So fairly typical. That they will then come together to create a plan. They're charged with creating a plan to meet the goals that the legislature already has around emissions reductions. We're putting those goals in statute, but the plan is to help us achieve the goals.
And we have put those goals in statute before.
Yes.
And so just putting those goals in statute clearly isn't enough. We needed to go a step further. And so both this commission and some of the accountability mechanisms in it are sort of the next step to really get it done.
Right. We can't do it without a plan. So, putting together this plan and, the governor and a few others, a few of my colleagues, a few actually key members on my committee that voted against the bill, wanted the legislature to have to approve the plan. And that is not, that's really a way to make sure that we do nothing.
For the listeners at home, you should have seen Laura's face just now, because you could tell she was trying to put together the right words to say that. Yes.
Sometimes they don't come out the correct words, but that's the honest truth. I mean, if we were, if in order for anything to happen, we had to approve the plan, it's likely that the plan would then become very political, and then, extended time for passage. Sort of like, so at the end of the day, I know I'm still thinking, I know you guys are laughing because you know what I'm doing. So at the end of the day, this plan will come forward, and in order for it to be enacted, we have to have rules that are brought forward, which are not laws, they're rules. And then,
can I one more sort of context pause for listeners? I don't know if we've ever gotten into the rulemaking process on the Montpelier Happy Hour before.
I don't think we have.
And we probably should spend a lot more time on it sometime. But I think what's important for people to understand is, so you make a law, and it's like, sometimes it's more specific than it actually should be, but it's often quite broad. And then the way the law is implemented, sort of the I think a normal person would call them policies and not rules, is
procedures, policies,
procedures, is a negotiation basically between the administration and the legislature. So the administration puts those forward. It's sort of the interpretation of the law. And then that's actually all approved by a committee in the legislature. It's a joint committee.
Right.
Yes, it's a joint legislative committee.
Yeah.
It's called
and it has to start with ICAR, which is, in the administration, where the administration has to look at these rules. So implementation of this plan will happen through new legislation, through rulemaking, and definitely through the appropriations process. And none of those things can happen without lawmakers. This is really significant legislation. And so, this notion that legislators, will not be accountable for the work, that legislators are not going to be held responsible for difficult decisions. Most legislators work really hard and, communicate, but you have some that don't pay attention, that aren't communicating, that don't know what's going on every issue. I mean, there's a lot that we're dealing with. So, in that case, I suppose it is possible that, some legislators may not know what's happening, may not participate in the process, may not help their constituents engage in creation of the plan. And all
that
of those things, I think, are our responsibility to do.
Yeah. And
in anything.
That would be true even if we were taking it back and passing legislation about it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
There would be disconnected folks. Yeah.
And absolutely, there always are. Mm-hmm. There always are. It's easier to be, what is the phrase? It's easier to be angry than, I don't know. Anyway, so those are two of the governor's points. And the third point, the 2 points were unelected, unaccountable board. Legislature doesn't have to approve them. Mm-hmm. So therefore, legislature gets to not be responsible for all these hard decisions that have to be made. The third point was about the cause of action and the right to sue. And, it did not matter how many times we walked through this, and we walked through it a number of times with the administration. I personally walked through it, probably close to a dozen times with various members of the administration. Citizens have the right to sue for enforcement of the law. They have the right to sue if they believe that, we legislated for legislative overreach, like we've made a mistake where we've passed a law that's in violation of the Constitution. And
that's like on a normal day, right? Like citizens can just sue anytime. That's
part of freedom.
Works. Yes.
That's part of democracy. Like you get to say, in our country, we have 3 branches of government. We have the legislative, the executive, and the judicial, and so the judicial, the courts are specifically in place to be a check on the administrative government, the governor, the president, and the legislative, us or our federal counterparts. And that is their role. That's why they exist. So that can happen now on anything. In fact, I personally have threatened to sue for enforcement of the waiting study, which I think we've talked about on this program before. I've threatened to sue the Secretary of Education for not following through with the law. This is something that is available and is a right and a responsibility of citizens living in a free state.
I think what's different, though, about the Global Warming Solutions Act is it sort of supports those lawsuits to be helpful, essentially. Mm-hmm. So in Massachusetts, especially, they went through a slightly similar process and came to a lawsuit, but the law that they had did not have the same mechanisms that the Global Warming Solutions Act has. And so when the lawsuit came, it went through court hearing after court hearing, up the chain, and there wasn't the same systems in place to just say, okay, there's a lawsuit, it's, found favorable or not, and then here is the solution. It goes directly to the administration to say implement. And so it caused a lot of time and a lot of confusion, whereas this rather than actually expanding the right to sue, it narrows the scope of what a lawsuit would look like.
Yes.
Good point.
Significantly.
Yes.
Yes.
And so
And
there's no monetary findings, there's
Yeah.
no anything. It's just the only way to sue on this is you sue to force the administration, a particular department in the administration, to say do your job.
Yeah. This was a very important issue for me as well. And so, I think I mentioned earlier that the bill had been introduced the year before and it was in an unworkable form. And there were two issues for me that had to happen in order for me to get on board with this bill. And I wanted to. One was we had to fix this cause of action piece. And the other was to ensure that it was clearly and definitely articulated that this plan would include and look specifically at our rural and vulnerable communities.
And that's the part I really want to talk about before you have to jump off, Laura. So there's what the governor was concerned about, which I think got a lot of media coverage and was sort of the main focus of the debate. But what I'm hearing from a few constituents about, and I'm sure you're hearing from more constituents about, is this fear, I think a warranted fear, that a sweeping solution to climate change and global warming is going to put anyone who has a sort of fuel-related job out of work, is going to force everyone to drive an electric car, and we're all going to have to move off our dirt roads and our mountaintops, like into efficiency apartments in the city. And so that sort of disruption to the way people are living their lives without regard for the financial impacts on struggling families is, I think, the Vermonters that I know, their biggest fear around climate change. And I think part of that is because the debate has been very, very class biased up until now. It's been righteous, it's been condescending, and it's focused really on 50 grand solar panels on people's brand new roofs and like the latest Tesla. And that's not what most of us can do when we think about climate change. So I would love to hear more about how you've really been thinking about this as someone who I know really cares deeply about the working class folks in your town and who also lives on a mountaintop.
Yeah, towns, 6 of them, very rural.
6 towns.
Emilie, we've done a lot of work on broadband as well. I know this is a passion you and I share. And, I equate some of this exactly to the broadband issue. We are left in many of our communities right now with this deteriorating, not going to be replaced copper landline. And for some of our folks, that's all they have to communicate. They don't have internet. They don't have cell, not available. And as that's getting worse and worse, no one is coming in to replace it. We have an emerging, really dangerous situation.
We are leaving people behind.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. And we've still left people behind when I think about climate change and the impact on some of our communities. It's, we still have communities that are suffering the effects of Irene that no one ever showed back up. And we actually have a bill on the floor today that I think is going to do some great work to support Mountain Home to to take that transition finally.
Yeah. So when I think about, and part of the reason that happened with telecommunications is just deregulation and our inability to really get our arms, and it's hard to think about replacing the whole telecommunications system in the state, right? And it's easier to kick the can down the road because that's expensive and difficult, and the federal government was not being helpful. Imagine what climate change is going to be like. And when I think about and I listen to the debate in my committee, we're talking about electric buses, and I'm often saying, okay, well, I appreciate this incentive around electric buses. That's great. We're helping to transform, transportation systems in places with population density. What is the effect that is having in our rural areas? And it will have effects. I'm fascinated by the economic effects of choices that we make in general. I listen to this great podcast, Freakonomics, which kind of looks at the unintended consequences. Yeah. So I think Emilie's right. This whole climate change people have been adapting that can afford to adapt. And that has economic consequences. Yesterday, I spoke about on the floor, BP, British Petroleum, it's one of the, I think they call them super majors. There's like 6 or 7 of them,
Yeah.
oil and gas exploration companies and companies in the world. They've made this major announcement of a billions in shift of their investments and business strategy away from oil and gas and into renewables and climate adaptation. And they're not doing that, out of the goodness of their heart.
Right.
That's a for-profit company.
Yeah.
And so, they're going to die if they don't adapt. So what does that mean for the rest of us? As the oil and gas is shifting, my little people in Reedsboro, like, they're not going to see this coming.
Mm-hmm.
And 5 years from now, when gas is $5 a gallon, because we're past peak oil, when it's going to be hard for them to adapt when we don't have electric charging infrastructure, when we don't have, when we haven't considered how jobs will adjust or shift because of climate change. It's going to be hard for them.
I appreciate what you're saying about the fact that, like, the world is adapting.
Yeah.
And we need to make sure we're in front of that adaptation, or so many of our communities going to get left behind. So rich people are adapting, corporations are adapting, and the rest of us need government in order to, like, really have the infrastructure to be adapting.
Or at least to help outline what is the plan, even to help private sector, see a means of, getting involved in our rural communities and seeing an opportunity to make money and helping those communities transform. But think about our schools, right? Yeah. These honking old fossil fuel systems. I've been on a school board for 17 years, 18 maybe now.
Thank you, Laura.
Too long. And I've seen some pretty wild fluctuations in the cost of oil and gas. I mean, if we are at peak oil, what's going to happen here? We need to have plans. You don't just on a dime say, okay, well, we're done with that. Now we're going to build, a $200,000 alternative heating structure for our, 100,000 square foot, building. We have some time to plan.
I like what both you, Laura, and Emilie are saying about this plan and adaptation, that I think we forget how much of it is connected to infrastructure, whether it's replacing a furnace with solar panels, whatever that infrastructure is, and we forget how expensive a lot of these infrastructure changes can be. And for rural communities, they are often so spread out that the companies in charge of building this infrastructure, aka broadband, there's no economy of scale for them. So there's no incentive in many cases for them to go in and do this work.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is not little stuff. This is a big deal, and it's consequential, and it's also not optional. So, this is happening. It's how we are going to respond to it that is optional. And, just leaving our, I'm not willing to just let those that can afford to adapt and leave my people behind. Again, I want a plan that includes my people and that allows us to think about how we can all protect ourselves and flourish in a changing economy.
So well said. Thank you.
It's so well said. And it's so well timed too, because Laura has to go to another meeting. And so even though there is a boatload of more things we could talk about with the Global Solutions Act, unfortunately we have to let Laura go. So hang in, listeners. Laura Sibilia, representative, thank you for joining us this morning. Hang on, listeners, on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. We will return in a moment. Welcome back to this second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and if you're just joining us, we, in the first half of this show, had Laura Sibilia on to talk about the Global Solutions Warming Act and climate change.
The Global
And
Warming
now
Solutions
we're going
Act.
to talk. Oh, good gosh, what did I call it?
I don't know. The words were in a different order. It's 7 o'clock in the morning. I don't think anyone. I'm just
don't hold it
record
against
straight. Me. No, I'm just setting the record straight.
I'm so glad you did.
Mm-hmm.
And now Emilie Kornheiser and I are going to talk about unemployment if we can get the words in the right order.
And the common theme, I think, across both of these conversations, there are many, but the one that's sticking with me today is that not leaving anyone behind.
Mm-hmm.
And want to remind folks listening wherever you are, watching wherever you are, that the views and opinions expressed here on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the host and the guests and anyone else who jumps into the screen, but not of any of the various stations this is played or shown on. Broadcast on, yeah. I also want to tell folks that, or really just tell you, Olga, because I don't know if we're going to have time for a toast today, that I was out of milk this morning because I didn't have time to go pick up my milk at the farm yesterday. Mm-hmm. And so I put chocolate gelato in my tea. So I'm having a really nice time of it over here.
I was thinking, I was looking at the size of your great big green mug and my mug and thinking, boy, I have not had enough caffeine. I'm not keeping up with.
I'm just drinking hot ice cream.
So you're just happy. You're unhappy.
I'm having a great day. Yeah, it's going to be a good day.
Oh, I have a heart on my mug.
That's also really nice.
It's just sweet.
Yeah.
We need that, and while we're talking about politics and people not being left behind.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so
in a world that's all topsy-turvy this week.
Oh, there's some deep apocalypse going around. Deep apocalypse. So
that's going to be the name of our second punk album.
Like as if there could be a shallow apocalypse. Like what? Like you don't need to modify the word apocalypse.
No, it kind of stands right on its own.
It really does. It's like, you would like, even like death, like gruesome death, like even that, like that maybe you could modify, but apocalypse, it doesn't, it's just there with those spiky A's. So, unemployment. Let's talk about it. We have talked about it a lot on the show. We know that the economy was shut down. I think probably everyone listening knows that when COVID came to America. Not when COVID came to Italy, which would have been a probably better time to shut down the economy so as to prevent many deaths, but we did not do that. And in some areas of the country, we have not shut anything down at all. But here in Vermont, we shut the economy down, and some other places that have large contributions to the U.S. economy, we also shut things down, such as New York. And so a lot of people are out of work. Mm-hmm. The legislature, back when it was in the real life, which was the week after town meeting, was the last week the legislature was in session.
For non-Vermonters, that's March.
Oh, thank you. That that week, we knew that stuff was getting dark, needed to prepare for it. So that final week, which is usually crossover week, it's the week we pass our final legislation before it goes over to the Senate or the House, the other body. We were focused on like emergency COVID legislation. And the Commerce Committee, which was the committee I was on then, not on that committee anymore, but we passed a bunch of modifications to unemployment insurance. And the one that I think is very important for today that I want to talk about is we changed the rules for why someone could quit a job and still be eligible for unemployment. Right. And the word quit is actually a technical word, and it just means depart, essentially. And so there's quit for cause and, no cause and firing and all this stuff, but essentially saying that someone could leave work because they don't have childcare related to COVID, or because they have a health concern or someone in their immediate family has a health concern that they need to care for. So those are two reasons that generally one cannot be on unemployment. In the pre-COVID world, if you were on unemployment and you didn't have childcare, that meant that you were not ready and willing to return to work, and so you were not eligible for unemployment. In this new COVID world, we were saying you're eligible for unemployment in those two categories, and we're not going to blame or penalize your employer for that. So there's something called an experience rating, which is how employers pay for their portion of unemployment insurance.
Mm-hmm.
So we did those things to really expand unemployment insurance into a safety net. Mm-hmm. Soon after that, the federal government picked up their shoes and put them on and got ready to face this issue a little bit.
Hold on, they're adult Pampers.
Maybe. They seem to have taken them off again, but they were on for a little while and they passed expanded unemployment benefits. That was an extra $600 a week, which made a huge difference in so many Vermonters' lives, because it meant that usually unemployment insurance is just a fraction of your weekly earnings. And this, for many Vermonters, brought it actually up above their regular weekly earnings.
Yeah.
Which is an incredibly beautiful, powerful thing to do when someone is living in extreme stress. Mm-hmm. It's saying, like, you're living in extreme stress. We all feel like the apocalypse is coming. We didn't know how apocalyptic it would be yet. And at least you won't have to worry about this one thing for now.
Yeah.
Then we entered the period where thousands of Vermonters tried to apply for unemployment. And we hit up against a computer system from 1983. Many people couldn't get unemployment. The state government fumbled and fumbled and fumbled and fumbled and fumbled. Legislators jumped in and tried to help. We helped somewhat. Lots of people then got unemployment, including the $600 benefit. That was great. Then we sort of entered the June-July period where there were still a lot of people struggling with adjudication, meaning if there was a challenge in your unemployment insurance application, you could only go to these very specialized folks who really understand unemployment procedures. And so you were going to be in a waiting period of purgatory for a long time.
And that's not stressful at all.
So stressful. And like, people will call you, and if you don't answer, you might have to wait another 3 weeks or month. I talked to some constituents on the phone who are just like bringing their phone with them everywhere. They were purposely not ever going anywhere, that they were out of range. They were like answering the phone at the playground with their kids before the playground shut down. All kinds of mess. There are still some folks trapped in that, mm-hmm. and still fighting hard for you. So then there's also a category of folks who, previous to this crisis, had been on unemployment at some point.
Oh.
And some of those folks encountered some problem while they were on unemployment, whether it was a paperwork error on their part, paperwork error on their employer's part, a paperwork error on the state's part, or someone maybe was getting more money than they thought they should, but like free money is really hard to say no to. And so a lot of those folks, eventually the state usually catches up with that error, but sometimes it's after the money's been going out the door for a long time. Mm. And when that happens, the state almost always finds that person at fault. Mm-hmm. And that person is basically assumed to have committed fraud. And
which is not a small thing.
It is not a small thing. And it's not necessarily, I want to almost say that the state assumes fraud to such an extent that it's value neutral about it. So some days I feel like the state just always assumes that everyone's a terrible person with bad intentions, and that's why they assume everyone's committing fraud. But I think actually bureaucracy is not in fact a person. And for the most part, it's just like the mechanisms in place assume fraud, and don't assume that fraud is bad or good. They just assume fraud. So there was a bunch of people who had that experience. And when that happens, you are both required to pay back that money out of your unemployment earnings. And you almost always wind up in something called penalty weeks, which are extra weeks that you cannot receive unemployment in addition to the time that you're paying back the unemployment benefits that are just punishment for your assumed fraud. So we have a whole category of folks who maybe years ago were on unemployment for a short time or a long time, wound up in this situation, and then have not been able to collect benefits during this period of complete crisis, where in good times, they might have been able to sort of hustle and get a job that might not be in their field or might not be the income that they want, but at least would make them as much as they would have on unemployment. In these times, people can't do that, especially, you know, say in March or April.
Right.
And so we have this whole category of people who aren't in adjudication, they're in penalty week land. So that was sort of happening, really became a big issue in May and June.
Okay.
Then in July, stay with me on this timeline here. In July, the extra $600 a month went poof away. And I've skipped the whole sort of contractor versus employee thing. We're not going to get into that today, but it added another layer of chaos and nuance to the whole thing. I think that's mostly been figured out. The extra $600 a month expired in July. Before that, a lot of people thought that the federal government was going to act to do something about that, but that did not happen,
right,
for a wide variety of reasons. And now people are in this really hard spot because unemployment's not enough to live on, and still many people don't have childcare or have health risks. So there are two things that are happening that I want to talk about today, now that I've gone through this whole long cycle, and I think we're almost out of time.
We can go a little bit over time, but you, of course, also have a meeting.
I do. I have to go to committee. I have to go to Ways and Means. So the things that are happening that I just sort of want to flag for people, because this is not like ever done, is that we, I put forward a bill to the House Commerce Committee to pause. It was actually to either to give the commissioner the right to cancel penalty weeks, and to say that during a crisis such as COVID, penalty weeks do not apply. And I think that's going to hopefully pass out of House Commerce today. And that feels like a big win. And they put in a mechanism that's not just during public health emergencies or other states of emergency. It's also just any time that the unemployment rate rises precipitously, meaning it rises very fast. So any economic crisis of any kind, whether that is because of public health or climate or whatever other version of the apocalypse, the penalty weeks will not apply. So that's really exciting. Also, when we put in those changes to the law around childcare and public health risks and health risks for unemployment, we did the opening, that's a reason to quit your job. We did not do the closing, what's a reasonable reason to refuse work in the future. So as the economy has been reopening, there have been some folks who have not been able to go back to work because we know that many people still do not have childcare because our schools are, well, that's an issue for another day. Maybe next
going
week.
Through what they're going. Yes.
And many folks still have health risks. And so folks are being offered work because their businesses are reopening, wherever they worked is reopening, but they're having to say no. And those folks are getting caught in that terrible adjudication whirlpool that I talked about earlier. So that same bill that I put forward is closing that loop and saying, like, making a little legal sandwich. This is a reasonable reason to quit. It's also a reasonable reason to refuse. Before COVID, that sandwich was in place. It was just a different sandwich. And so we've, so glad to sort of close that loop. Any reason that it would be a reasonable reason to quit is also a reasonable reason to refuse work. So that's really nice. The last thing is that the federal government put forward a brand new mechanism to add extra money onto unemployment benefits. It was $300 a week. It's through FEMA for some reason that doesn't really make sense to me, and offered states the ability to add extra $100 in benefits. Because of this FEMA thing, and I think because the federal government right now with this administration likes to make everything as difficult as possibly possible to administer, so they can pretend that they're meeting people's needs, but in fact then state governments get completely blamed for not meeting people's needs. We have that right now in front of us in the State House. Okay. So it will be only a few weeks. It's only enough money from the feds to do a few weeks of this additional benefits. We have to set up a totally different administration system for it, which will cost the state money. But we are wanting to move forward with that, hoping to make that work, and hoping to add an extra $100 on top of that. And sort of that's something that's being discussed right now in the legislature, where that extra $100 a week would come from. So it's $300 from the feds, and then we paste in an extra $100 from Vermont. And that would only be for a few weeks, but a few weeks is better than nothing. And maybe by then we will have a Congress that can get it done.
November is around the corner.
Oh.
Well, thank you, Emilie, and thank you for getting all that in. And so we do have a quick moment for a toast, and I want to toast, actually, oddly as it is, I want to toast COVID, because it has given us the impetus, I guess is the word we're looking for, and the kick up the backside to actually start filling in many of the holes in our society that existed before COVID. But now we're actually paying attention to them. So there's the silver linings.
The veil being pulled off. And ice cream in your tea.
And ice cream in your tea. Okay. I'm going to try that next week.
Thank
so,
you.
Emilie, if people need to find you, where can they find you?
Oh, such a good question. They can find me at emiliekornheiser.org or on any of your usual social media channels, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Emilie Kornheiser Works. There's two Facebooks. There's my personal Facebook and my representative Facebook. Nothing happens on the personal Facebook. So you're welcome to friend me, but it will be boring for you. The other places you can find me is every Saturday at 10 a.m. hosting a community conversation via Zoom. You can find the links to that at any of the channels I previously mentioned, or feel free to email me or give me a call. You can find all of those addresses on my website, so I don't have to spell my last name for you here on the radio.
And you're listening to the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station, as well as Brattleboro Community Television and good old favorite YouTube. You can find us at 2 p.m. on the radio station or anytime on our Vermontitude SoundCloud page or our Vermontitude Facebook page. Have a great weekend, everyone.